In 1348, London didn't collapse because its systems broke down. It collapsed because those systems kept working, right up until they couldn't. Within roughly a year and a half, close to half the city's population was dead, not from an invading army, not from starvation, from a disease that moved through the very trade routes, alleyways, and social networks London had spent generations building. The city's greatest strength became its delivery mechanism. And here's what makes this more than a medieval horror story. The underlying logic hasn't changed. Every modern city, every large institution, every networked economy still runs on the same quiet assumption that what held together yesterday will hold together tomorrow. London in 1348 tested that assumption and didn't survive the test intact. Welcome to Beneath the Century, the channel where we dig into how civilizations were actually constructed, why they came apart, and what patterns carried forward into the world that followed. London's experience with the plague might be the starkest case study we have. To understand why the Black Death hit London as hard as it did, you have to understand what London actually was in 1348. Somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people lived inside its walls, an enormous concentration for medieval Europe. Ships arrived daily from Flanders, France, Genoa, and ports across the Mediterranean, unloading wine, cloth, spices, and grain. The guilds ran skilled industry with something approaching clockwork precision. The church organized daily life, managed hospitals, and kept social order in ways secular authorities simply couldn't. From any outside view, London looked like a city that had figured something out. But the infrastructure underneath all that prosperity was built for one condition: continued growth, not resilience, not the capacity to absorb a shock. Streets were packed so tightly that two people could barely pass each other. Whole families lived and slept in single rooms. Waste, animal and human, accumulated in alleyways, sometimes simply piling up, other times washing directly into the Thames, the same river much of the city drank from. These weren't oversights. They were the natural result of a city that kept adding people faster than it could update its basic systems. As long as nothing disrupted the rhythm, the whole thing functioned. Then the ships brought something the rhythm couldn't absorb. Sometime in the summer of 1348, trading vessels arrived in London carrying rats. The rats carried fleas, and the fleas carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind what we now call the Black Death. The early deaths were easy to dismiss: a laborer near the docks, a cloth merchant in the city center, a child near the river wharves. Isolated, they didn't look like a pattern. London was used to disease. Winter took people every year. But the plague didn't require a weakened city to spread. It just needed a connected one. Priests moved from sickbed to sickbed, administering last rites, carrying infection between households without knowing it. The daily markets pulled thousands of people into close contact every single morning. Apprentices traveled between workshops scattered across the city. Goods and the people handling them were constantly in motion. Every system London had built to make commerce and community function was now functioning as a distribution network for something it had no defense against. The plague didn't need to fight London's infrastructure. It rode it. By autumn, the bells of the city's churches were ringing for the dead almost without pause. By winter, there were periods where they stopped, not because the dying had slowed, but because there wasn't always someone left to ring them. The disease itself was devastating. But what followed created a second crisis, one that nearly finished what the plague had started. The people who kept London operational, not its rulers but its workers, were dying in enormous numbers. Bakers, cart drivers, water carriers, the men who moved grain from the wharves to the markets, the priests who maintained communal life, officials who kept basic administration running. They died at the same rate as everyone else, sometimes faster, because their work kept them in constant contact with others. Food still existed beyond the city walls. The farms hadn't disappeared, but getting it inside, processing it, distributing it, all of that depended on human chains that were breaking apart. This is the piece of the story people often miss. A city can remain physically standing while becoming functionally impossible to live in. The buildings were still there. The walls were still there. The river was still there. But the invisible layer of coordinated human activity that made it a city rather than just a collection of structures, that layer was collapsing. At East Smithfield, emergency burial pits were dug outside the city walls. Bodies were laid in rows, stacked in layers, because individual burial, the ritual medieval society considered essential, had become logistically impossible. The city hadn't been defeated in any traditional sense, but it was failing at the things that actually mattered. When the plague finally began to slow, the people who emerged from it found themselves living in a world that had reorganized itself around a single new reality. Labor was suddenly, shockingly, scarce. Before 1348, the balance of power between employers and workers in England had been heavily weighted toward wealthy landowners and guildmasters. There was always another worker available. Wages were kept low, partly by custom, partly by necessity, and partly by the simple fact that workers had limited alternatives after the plague. That calculus was gone. Employers who needed workers had to compete for them. Laborers began asking for higher wages and getting them. The English crown moved quickly to prevent this from destabilizing the existing order. In 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Laborers, which made it illegal to demand or pay wages above pre-plague rates. The intent was to freeze social and economic relations in place, to pretend, essentially, that the workforce hadn't been cut roughly in half. The problem was that the same catastrophe that had created the labor shortage had also gutted the enforcement apparatus. Local officials were depleted. Landowners were quietly paying above the legal rates anyway because they had no choice. The statute became one of those laws that existed mainly on paper. What followed wasn't a revolution, at least not immediately. It was something slower and in some ways more durable. A gradual renegotiation of what ordinary labor was actually worth. The old feudal compact, which had kept peasants tied to land and lords for generations, started losing its grip. Not all at once and not without resistance. The peasants' revolt of 1381 showed exactly how far that tension could go. But the direction of change had already been set. The longer-term consequences of the Black Death spread well beyond wages and labor law. As decades passed, workers across England and Europe moved more freely, changed employers more readily, and participated in a labor market that looked meaningfully different from anything that had existed before. The rigid hierarchy of medieval society was still there, but it had become more porous, more negotiable. Governments also drew a lesson that took time to fully articulate, but proved lasting. Cities needed to be designed with crisis in mind, not just optimized for normal conditions. public sanitation programs, quarantine regulations, urban health boards. All of these began taking shape in the century after the plague, particularly in Italian city-states like Venice and Florence, which had been hit severely and had the administrative capacity to respond systematically. The echoes of that shift are still with us. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the debates cities had about quarantine, about contact tracing, about how to keep essential supply chains running while limiting movement, were structurally identical to problems medieval London had already encountered. The tools were different. The underlying tension was exactly the same. The connections that make a city powerful also make it vulnerable. There's a pattern in what happened to London in 1348 that turns up repeatedly across history in systems of very different scales and types. Systems optimized purely for efficiency tend to be brittle when conditions change suddenly. The more tightly coupled the components, the more each part depends on every other part functioning normally, the more catastrophically the whole thing can fail when just one element is removed or disrupted. London's density, its trade networks, its constant movement of people and goods, these were the sources of its prosperity and the precise mechanisms of its vulnerability. London didn't survive the Black Death because it was prepared. No one was prepared. The disease was unlike anything the medieval world had faced in living memory, and the responses it produced were mostly improvised under pressure. What London and England survived into was a changed world, one the plague had forced into existence. And in that changed world, they eventually rebuilt something more resilient, even if they couldn't have planned it that way. That's the pattern history keeps returning to, and it's what beneath the century keeps following. Not the dramatic moments of collapse, though those matter, but the architecture underneath, the invisible systems of supply, trust, labor, and coordination that hold a civilization together. When that architecture holds, everything above it looks stable and inevitable. When it starts to crack, everything people assumed would continue suddenly becomes uncertain.